Grand Junction, Colorado, a small town in the western United States, may seem like a peaceful place at first glance. Situated in the Colorado River Valley, surrounded by mountains and deserts, it exudes the typical tranquility of small towns. Its inhabitants, for the most part, live quiet lives with a slow pace and predictable routine. But, like every town, it holds secrets, mysteries, and events waiting to be revealed in its shadows. On February 27, 2021, one of these disturbing stories would begin to unfold. That night, the biting winter cold seemed to envelop the city in a blanket of silence. The night sky was cloudy, and the streetlights reflected off the dewdrops forming on the surfaces. Few were awake at that late hour, and most of Grand Junction's citizens barely noticed when a tragedy was about to unfold. Beneath an overpass that cut through the city, a solitary figure moved in the shadows. At first glance, there was nothing peculiar about the place, just another city spot where people passed by without paying much attention. But that night, something was out of place. Not far from where the overpass stretched, a man known as Warren Barnes was taking his usual walk as he did every night. He was a 69-year-old homeless man, but much loved by those who knew him. His greatest pastime was reading, always with a book in his hands, and he was known for his calm and politeness. He had no family, but he had friends. He knew many people in local establishments and, despite his condition, seemed to find comfort in the little things in life. That night, however, Barnes was about to become yet another victim of the cruel fate that befalls those who live on the fringes of society. It's unclear exactly what happened at that moment, but something caused him to approach a young stranger, Brian Cohee Jr., who was waiting. Brian, only 19 years old, lived in a suburb of Grand Junction and seemed like an ordinary young man at first glance, with no criminal record. But what he did that night would forever change the fate of everyone involved. What seemed like a casual encounter would soon turn into a nightmare. No one knew it, but while the city slept, a heinous crime was about to happen in a seemingly peaceful place. Brian, motivated by reasons he couldn't fully explain, made an unthinkable decision. Something inside him seemed to have broken, or perhaps it had been planned. But the fact is that, at that moment, Warren Barnes was the victim of an act that no one in Grand Junction could have predicted. What would happen next was unknown to anyone. What began as a simple interaction between two strangers on the city streets would transform into one of the most horrific crimes in Grand Junction's history. The consequences would be devastating for everyone involved, and a mystery began to unfold in the city's shadows. But the answers wouldn't come easily, and what seemed like just another ordinary night for the locals would reveal itself to be something far darker. The worst, however, was only beginning. The truth was about to come to light, and the story of Brian Cohee and Warren Barnes would leave a deep mark on the memory of Grand Junction. Before we continue with this shocking story, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates. Brian Cohee's case will become even more disturbing as you discover what happened in the following weeks, and you won't want to miss any details. Stay with us, because the unfolding of this macabre plot will keep you hooked from beginning to end. Warren Barnes was a discreet presence who had gradually become part of the Grand Junction landscape. People recognized him by his calm gait and the faithful companion of a worn book, which he carried like a talisman. He didn't make a fuss. He didn't ask for anything. He occupied his corner of the sidewalk, opened the volume to the page marked with an old receipt, and let the world unfold around him. He was, as some shopkeepers whispered, a street reader. He liked biographies, stories that spanned decades and continents, as if he found comfort in lives that had an organized beginning, middle, and end. Unlike his present life nestled among the city's cracks, in the morning, he would appear when the sun shone obliquely on the shop windows. He would greet with an almost imperceptible wave, receive a cup of coffee offered by hands that already knew his routine, and move away so as not to disrupt the flow. Anyone observing closely would notice a ritual: sitting down, adjusting his worn backpack between his feet, smoothing the spine of the book, mentally checking the point where he had stopped. Sometimes, He would interrupt his reading to jot down a word in the corner of a pamphlet. He seemed to like precise terms, those that refine the idea until it becomes a bridge between a memory and the present. There were windy and dusty days, days of light snow, and even then he would appear, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, attentive to his own silence. Little was known about Warren's past, and this uncertainty ended up shaping his figure with a kind of respect that the city generally reserves for stories it doesn't ask about. Perhaps he had distant relatives, perhaps not. Perhaps an old job somewhere on the interstate. Perhaps a profession that memory preferred not to revisit. What was known, in fact, was how he treated people. Polite, brief, grateful. He refused help when it came in the form of showing off, accepted it when it was offered as a sincere gesture, and he continued on, protected by a dignity that remained intact even on bad days. The public library was a few blocks away, and it was natural to assume he'd show up there from time to time. No one monitored his movements, but the murmur of pages turned, spines consulted, a reader returning books exactly as he found them, circulated among those who also enjoyed losing track of time among the shelves. Warren seemed to have an intimate map of the city. He knew the shady spots in summer, the wind's retreats in winter, the benches that were less cold after midday. In the afternoon, sometimes, he changed spots. He looked for a gap under the concrete, where the light didn't bother him, and the street noise became a vague trail, perfect for immersing himself in yet another chapter. There was something artisan-like in the way he organized his few belongings. A pen that worked, a thin notebook with scattered pages, an elastic band holding clippings where he underlined phrases that seemed fitting. He didn't seem to collect things. He collected passages, and each passage was a small anchor, a way of fixing himself somewhere in time. From time to time, he exchanged 2 or 3 words with whoever was willing to talk. He asked little, answered just enough, as if he feared that an excess of biography would spoil the silence where he breathed best. The shopkeepers learned to read his presence like one reads a street clock. If he didn't show up at a certain time, someone noticed. If he appeared earlier, another noticed. It was a kind of diffuse care, without an owner, but one that made itself felt collectively. The coffee offered without questions, the glass of water in the heat, the thought of leaving a coat on the hanger for when the cold arrived more harshly. And yet, Warren preserved a margin, an invisible limit that he didn't cross. Gratitude came in his gaze, in the murmured, "Thank you." But the next step was always his. In late February, the air in Grand Junction carried the hesitation of a season that can't decide. The nights were long, the asphalt held moisture, and the noises sometimes seemed to echo too loudly under the viaduct structures. Warren continued reading, turning pages, marking lines, putting his hands in his pockets when the wind blew sharply. Daily life went on and his figure, thin and serene, served as a sign that the hours were in place. Those who saw him might not imagine that this regularity, so fragile and so persistent, could vanish from one moment to the next. But for now, it was just that. A man and a book, the city around him, and the improbable peace that is achieved when reading creates a home where there are no doors or walls. In the early morning of February 27, 2021, the city of Grand Junction was in its usual nocturnal silence. The sky was covered by clouds, obscuring the stars, and the icy wind cut through the main street with the smoothness of a blade. At that hour, most of the city's residents were in their homes, with the lights off, and life went on without major interruptions. However, in the shadows of the viaduct that cut through the city, something much darker was beginning to unfold. Warren Barnes, as on many previous nights, was there, in his routine that had become part of the city. Sitting under the overpass, where the concrete structure offered a small shelter from the cold wind, he read his book with the calm attention of someone lost in the words. No one knew what he was thinking that night, but everything indicated that his night would be like any other. He didn't expect that fate was watching him, waiting for the exact moment to transform his life, until then simple and silent, into part of a cruel and inexplicable enigma. It was in this setting that Brian Cohee Jr., a 19-year-old that's appeared. Born and raised in Grand Junction, Cohee wasn't a well-known figure in the city, but his presence that night would be forever etched in memory. Until then, he seemed like just another young man from the neighborhood, with no criminal record and no apparent reason for doing what he did. His motives, in his mind, seemed distant and disconnected. But the moment his path crossed with Warren Barnes's, destiny intervened. Brian was unaware of what was about to happen. He walked down the street, but his mind was elsewhere, in some hazy place where rationality and madness intertwine. What led him to stop on that overpass and approach Warren Barnes would remain a matter of speculation, but the fact is that, at that moment, the encounter between the two men would not be by chance. There is little information about exactly what happened between the two at that moment. Some accounts indicate that Brian approached Warren in a seemingly normal way, perhaps even with a polite greeting. But something wasn't right. The young man seemed impulsive, driven by something deeper, something he couldn't explain even to himself. It's unknown whether there was an argument or if it all happened in a brief encounter. But the result was clear and horrific. Warren Barnes was brutally attacked by Brian. What followed was a sequence of actions that quickly spiraled out of Brian's control. He didn't know what he was doing, or perhaps he did, and was consumed by an irrational impulse. What happened between them on that overpass was so violent that it left the city in shock, unable to comprehend how a seemingly ordinary young man could have done something so horrific. What was most disturbing was the nature of the crime. It wasn't just a fight or an isolated incident, but an act of extreme violence that seemed inexplicable. After committing the crime, Brian showed no immediate signs of remorse. Instead, he left the scene almost mechanically, as if he had simply completed a task that, to him, seemed to be finished. Without any effort to hide what he had done, he left the crime scene and went home, where what he would do next would begin to irreversibly unravel his life. The following morning, the city was still asleep, unaware that horror had already taken shape. Warren Barnes' body wasn't found immediately, but what was about to happen would have a chain reaction leading directly to the discovery of the crime. For Brian Cohee Jr., however, the consequences of what he had done would begin to become increasingly inevitable. The city's silence would be broken in a way no one could have anticipated. And it was from that moment that the story of Brian Cohee and the fate of Warren Barnes became irreversibly intertwined. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, and the town of Grand Junction, until then a place of tranquility, would become the stage for one of the most shocking cases its inhabitants had ever witnessed. The crime committed by Brian would not be just another story for the local newspapers, but an event that would be etched in the collective memory of the city and that would provoke unanswered questions that still echo to this day. Brian Cohee Jr. grew up in Grand Junction, but no one really knew him well. At the time of the crime, he was 19 years old and, like many young people, was trying to find his place in the world. There were no clear signs of trouble or violent behavior in his past. On the contrary, he was considered an ordinary teenager, with no involvement in illegal activities or criminal records to mark him. His childhood friends remembered him as someone quiet, more focused on the little things in life than on grand ambitions. He was a young man who seemed to be just beginning to shape his adult life. But for some reason, on that February night, something inside Brian seemed to have changed. What motivated him to make that terrible decision upon meeting Warren Barnes under the overpass is a question that, to this day, remains without a clear explanation. There are no reports that the two had met before, nor that they had any kind of interaction or bond that would justify the encounter. At that moment, everything Brian did seemed impulsive, irrational, and without any understandable reason to those who knew him. Brian approached Warren, who was at his usual reading spot, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. There is no record of Warren perceiving any imminent threat or that anything in Brian's behavior indicated danger. The strangest thing of all is that, by all accounts, the crime was committed without a clear reason, without an argument or personal motive between the two men. There was no robbery, theft, or fight, just an act of extreme violence that, in a matter of minutes, would destroy not only Warren's life, but also Brian's. After the attack, Brian, seemingly without immediate remorse, left the crime scene without haste or despair. He went on with his life, unaware that he was about to face the consequences of what he had done. That morning, he returned home as if nothing had happened. But the crime scene would not remain silent for long. Hours later, Brian's mother, who was at home, would make a macabre discovery that would set in motion the chain of events leading to the young man's arrest. She found parts of Warren Barnes' body in one of the closets in Brian's house. There are no exact details about how she came across Barnes' remains, but the shock and horror of the discovery were evident. Frightened and unsure how to react, Brian's mother immediately contacted the police, who quickly arrived at the family's home. The discovery of the human remains was only the beginning of Brian's nightmare. Upon arriving at the crime scene, the police immediately began questioning the young man, who, at first, showed no clear signs of remorse or understanding of the gravity of what he had done. There was no crying, no despair, only a disturbing calm. It was at this moment that the truth began to emerge. During the interrogation, Brian, without hesitation, confessed what he had done. He did not try to justify or hide the violence of his actions. On the contrary, he seemed more interested in explaining the motives that led him to commit the crime. Although those motives remained unclear, his confession, recorded on video, was incredibly cold and disjointed. Brian did not seem to realize the magnitude of what he was saying, nor the devastating impact of his words. "I always wanted to know what it was like," he said when questioned about the attack. That phrase alone encapsulated the coldness and detachment with which he dealt with what he had done. It was as if he were talking about an experiment or an insatiable curiosity, rather than a brutal crime that took the life of an innocent man. Brian's indifference to his own confession was something that haunted investigators and left everyone perplexed about what was really going on in the young man's mind. While the police worked to gather more evidence and understand what had motivated that inexplicable act, the rest of the city of Grand Junction began to feel the weight of the tragedy. No one knew how to react. No one knew what to say about that young man who, until then, seemed to be just another ordinary face on the city streets. What had led Brian Cohee to commit such a brutal crime? The answer was yet to come, but at that moment, no one could foresee the complexity of the case and the questions it would raise about the nature of violence and sanity. The morning after Brian Cohee Jr.'s arrest, Grand Junction was still enveloped in its daily rhythm, but there was something in the air that couldn't be ignored. The case of Warren Barnes, a man beloved by many in the city, and the brutality of the crime that killed him, began to take shape in local headlines, spreading a climate of shock and disbelief among the residents. People couldn't understand how a seemingly quiet young man, whom no one considered a threat, could be involved in something so horrific. The initial information about the crime was vague. Warren Barnes' body was found dismembered and hidden in parts inside Brian's house, which left the town even more stunned. There was no sign of a robbery or an obvious motive for the murder, which made the case even more incomprehensible. How could someone commit such a savage act without any clear motive, without any visible reason to justify it? The townspeople were perplexed, and questions began to pile up. What could have led Brian to act this way? Was he ill? Was he under the influence of something? Or had he somehow planned it? As the investigations progressed, the Grand Junction police tried to piece together the puzzle. The first important piece of evidence came from Brian Cohee's own confession. During questioning, he admitted to being the perpetrator of the crime, but instead of showing remorse, he seemed more concerned with what he had done than with the consequences of his actions. The coldness with which he recounted the event was disturbing. He didn't seem to care about Warren's death, nor about the pain it would cause the victim's friends and family. In his mind, it seemed to be some kind of experiment, as if he were merely satisfying a macabre curiosity that had never been confronted before. The details of Brian's confession were vague, but his expression during questioning was clear. He seemed largely oblivious to the harm he had caused. This lack of empathy and the way he emotionally distanced himself from the crime fueled speculation that he might be suffering from some kind of psychological disorder. The defense began to suggest that Brian was suffering from a mental illness or some kind of psychological disorder that led him to commit the crime, an idea that would be explored during the trial. The case quickly gained attention outside of Grand Junction. The contrast between the tranquility of the town and the brutal nature of the crime led to it being reported on major local and state news networks. The mystery surrounding Brian Cohee's motivations began to fuel debates about mental health, youth violence, and the factors that can lead a person to commit such unthinkable acts. At the same time, the town of Grand Junction, which had always been peaceful, found itself at the center of a case that seemed to defy all logical explanations. Meanwhile, the local community was grappling with the loss of Warren Barnes. Many remembered him as a gentleman, a hermit in a way, but someone who brought a kind of serenity wherever he was. His habit of reading books in the street wasn't uncommon, but the way he seemed disconnected from the tumultuous life around him made him an almost mystical figure to those who knew him. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't make demands. He simply existed in his quiet routine. The pain of losing such a simple and innocent man shook everyone who knew him. However, there was also a sense of frustration and helplessness, because, for many, it seemed that Warren's death had no reason, no purpose. As the case progressed, the issue of Brian Cohee's mental health gained more prominence. The defense began to explore the idea that he suffered from some psychological disorder, something that would explain his lack of motivation for the crime and his indifference to the suffering he caused. Was this an attempt to minimize Brian's responsibility for his actions? Or was he truly incapable of understanding the gravity of his acts? The idea that Brian might have been driven by something beyond his mental control began to gain traction. But would that be enough to absolve him of responsibility for such a horrific crime? As the trial approached, the city of Grand Junction prepared for what appeared to be a complicated and emotionally charged process. Questions of mental health, motivation, and criminal responsibility would be put to the test, and many wondered what the final verdict might mean for a young man who, until that moment, seemed to live an ordinary life, but who had somehow transformed into an unthinkable criminal. What would become of Brian Cohee? Would he spend the rest of his life behind bars, or could he be deemed mentally incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions? The city anxiously awaited answers, unaware of how profoundly this case would alter many people's perception of the nature of crime and sanity. As Brian Cohee's case progressed to court, the city of Grand Junction found itself on the brink of an emotional and legal upheaval. The horrific crime Brian committed against Warren Barnes did not appear to be a simple case of violence or despair, but something more complex, perhaps rooted in a deep psychological issue. Brian's defense had already begun constructing a narrative around the insanity plea, suggesting that the young man was mentally incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions. The question hanging over the case was clear. Was Brian Cohee guilty of first-degree murder? Or was he, in fact, incapable of understanding what he had done due to a mental disorder? Brian Cohee's trial began in late January 2023 and quickly became one of the most talked about cases in Grand Junction, attracting attention from local media and even some national outlets. The court was ready to hear the details of a brutal crime and investigate the psychological state of the accused boy, who, up to that point, seemed far removed from empathy and remorse. During the early stages of the trial, emotions ran high for both the defense and the prosecution. Throughout the trial, the defense attempted to convince the jury that Brian had committed the crime without fully understanding his actions. Defense attorneys argued that he was not entirely responsible for what he had done, presenting a series of psychological evaluations suggesting he suffered from some type of mental disorder. But despite these claims, the line between insanity and premeditation seemed too thin for many. In an attempt to demonstrate that Brian was incapable of understanding the gravity of his act, defense attorneys cited reports from psychiatrists suggesting he was experiencing some kind of emotional crisis, although without a clear explanation of why he had become so impulsive and violent that night. Experts spoke of a possible history of personality disorders or undiagnosed issues, but none of this seemed to provide sufficient justification for the brutality of the crime. The prosecution, on the other hand, maintained that Brian was fully capable of understanding his actions. The prosecutor focused on the coldness and lack of remorse with which Brian had confessed to the crime. The famous phrase Brian uttered during his interrogation, "I always wanted to know what it was like," was repeatedly used by the prosecution to show that he did not act impulsively, but that there was intent, a kind of morbid curiosity that motivated him to commit the murder. He was not merely acting out of a fit of rage or despair. It seemed to the prosecutors that he had planned the attack, or at least conceived it rationally, even if in a disturbed manner. The fact that he left Warren's dismembered body hidden in his house, without attempting to conceal his actions, was also presented as evidence of his awareness of the crime. There were no signs of panic or remorse, indicating that he knew exactly what he was doing, even if his motivations were difficult to understand. During the trial, tensions rose, and Brian's behavior continued to be a central point of contention. He seemed disconnected from everything happening around him. His posture during questioning, his cold confession, and his overall attitude toward the case began to make it clear that he wasn't responding to the conventions of guilt and remorse, as many would expect. He appeared to be in a state of complete indifference to his victim's suffering and the gravity of his actions. This disconcerting behavior further fueled doubts about his mental health, but also generated criticism about his possible manipulation of the situation, using the insanity plea as a way to escape full punishment. The jurors faced a difficult choice. The case unfolded like a puzzle. An inexplicable brutality, a young man with no apparent history of violence, and a defense suggesting he was incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. But did Brian truly believe his actions were without consequences? Or was he simply trying to evade responsibility for something he knew was horrific, but didn't want to confront? The trial, which lasted several weeks, was marked by intense moments of emotion, especially when the testimonies of Warren Barnes, friends, and the victim's family were heard. They spoke of a kind and peaceful man, someone who, even in his homeless situation, had dignity and a calm presence, and who was now brutally lost. Their grief contrasted sharply with Brian's coldness, making it all the more difficult for the jurors and the local community to process. Time passed, and the evidence piled up. The jury was preparing to reach a decision, but the answer to a crucial question remained. Would Brian Cohee be found guilty of first-degree murder, or would his insanity plea change the course of the case and result in a more lenient verdict? The city of Grand Junction was anxiously waiting to see how the court would resolve this conundrum, and how justice would be served in a case that, more than any other, challenged the boundaries of responsibility and sanity. Brian Cohee's trial was nearing its end, and the city of Grand Junction was preparing to hear the verdict. The case, which had been shocking from the start, took on even greater proportions as the days passed. What seemed to be an inexplicable crime, without a clear motive, was now transforming into a complex legal and psychological dilemma. The jury faced a difficult choice. Should Brian be held responsible for a brutal homicide? Or should he be considered mentally incapable of understanding his actions? As the defense argued, the prosecution had endeavored to present a strong case, arguing that Brian Cohee was not only fully aware of what he was doing, but also that the crime stemmed from a morbid curiosity, something he had nurtured and somehow acted upon on that fateful February night. The prosecutor focused on Brian's words during his interrogation, especially the phrase that stuck in everyone's memory. "I always wanted to know what it was like." For the prosecutor, this was clear evidence of premeditation, of a conscious desire to explore something dark and disturbing, without any consideration for the consequences of his actions. Furthermore, Brian's behavior after the crime was also used against him. He didn't try to hide what he had done. He didn't rush to flee, and he showed no signs of panic or remorse. His attitude throughout the process was strange, almost indifferent. For the prosecution, this indicated that Brian knew what he was doing and didn't care about the suffering he would cause. He didn't act on impulse, but out of a cold desire to satisfy a macabre curiosity, without any consideration for Warren Barnes' whole life. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Brian Cohee suffered from a mental illness, a disorder that rendered him incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions. They presented a series of expert testimonies that Brian was not in full mental capacity at the time of the crime. According to the psychiatrists, he had difficulty processing his emotions and frequently became detached from reality. The defense suggested that, although Brian might seem rational and normal to many people, he was, in fact, suffering from a profound psychological disorder that affected his ability to make conscious and responsible decisions. The evidence and testimony weighed heavily, and the jury had to consider what truly motivated Brian to commit the crime. The decision was complex. If he were convicted of first-degree murder, he would face a life sentence without the possibility of parole, which seemed a just punishment for what he had done. However, if the jury believed he was mentally incapacitated, the verdict would be different, and he could be sent to a psychiatric institution instead of prison, where he would spend the rest of his life being treated for his mental condition. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense as the jury retired to deliberate. It was impossible not to feel the weight of the decision that was about to be made. Many members of the Grand Junction community were following the case closely, and what happened from then on would have a lasting impact on the city, which was still trying to process the shock of the crime and the legal complexities that accompanied it. During the days of deliberation, the jurors were required to analyze the evidence meticulously, weighing the testimonies of the psychiatrists, the details of Brian's confession, and the impact of the crime on the lives of those who knew Warren Barnes. It was a moment of great responsibility, and no one knew exactly how the verdict would be received by the community. The tension was palpable, and doubt hung in the air. What would become of Brian Cohee? Would he face the consequences of his actions? Or would he be placed in a treatment system where he would be kept away from society, but without the full weight of criminal responsibility? Finally, after days of intense deliberations, the jury returned to the courtroom to announce its decision. The judge gazed intently at the jurors, and a profound silence fell over all present. When the verdict was read, the words were clear and definitive. Brian Cohee was found guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. He would be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some felt relieved, believing that justice had been served, and that such a horrific crime should not be treated leniently. Others, however, questioned the decision, especially those who believed that Brian truly suffered from a profound mental disorder and that his responsibility should be mitigated by his condition. Regardless of the viewpoint, one thing was certain: the once tranquil and peaceful town of Grand Junction would never be the same again. The case of Brian Cohee and the murder of Warren Barnes became a landmark in the city's history, not only for the brutal act itself, but for the questions it raised about mental health, criminal responsibility, and the nature of violence. The city not only lost one of its most beloved residents, but was also forced to confront the complex realities of the human mind and the limits of justice. The case, with all its layers of emotional and legal complexity, would forever be etched in the collective memory of Grand Junction. After the guilty verdict and the life sentence without the possibility of parole, Brian Cohee's case finally seemed to have found legal closure. But for the city of Grand Junction, the impact of the tragedy was far from over. The death of Warren Barnes and the brutality of the crime, committed by a seemingly ordinary young man, continued to reverberate throughout the community, fueling a series of discussions about violence, mental health, and justice. The legal process had been painful for everyone involved. For Warren Barnes, family, and friends, the verdict did not bring the comfort many had imagined. The loss of a man who, although homeless, was seen as a peaceful and polite figure, left a deep void. Many in the city were shaken to realize that the victim was not just another homeless person, but someone who had a life rich in stories, who interacted with the community and was respected by those who knew him. Warren was not just a statistic. He had an identity, a voice, and a past that were now irretrievably erased. The pain of losing Warren was accompanied by bewilderment at what motivated Brian to commit such an act. The 19-year-old, who had previously seemed like just another ordinary teenager in the city, was now serving a life sentence, and the answers to what led him to kill such a harmless man remained elusive. The insanity plea raised by the defense never fully convinced the city or the jury. Even though experts had suggested that Brian might have had psychological problems, many still couldn't understand how someone could commit such a terrible act without a clearer explanation. Brian's case defied everyone's comprehension, leaving a widespread sense of unease. What made everything even more distressing was Brian's coldness throughout the process. He seemed to show no remorse, which fueled the debate about his true capacity to feel and understand the gravity of his actions. Many couldn't understand if he was simply trying to evade responsibility by pleading insanity, or if he was, in fact, dealing with deep psychological issues that rendered him incapable of acting rationally. Brian's distant and almost indifferent behavior was one of the most disturbing elements of the case, leading the city to reflect on how society deals with young people like him who seem so disconnected from the reality around them. For the city of Grand Junction, the case wasn't just about the crime itself, but about the broader questions it raised. How can we prevent something like this from happening? How can we ensure that young people experiencing emotional or psychological difficulties receive adequate care before their pain leads them to commit irreparable acts? The Cohee case brought to the forefront issues of mental health, the resources available to those suffering from undiagnosed disorders, and the need for a more effective support system to prevent youth violence. While the city grappled with the loss of Warren and the complexity of the case, many of these questions remained without clear answers. Furthermore, Brian Cohee's trial highlighted how the justice system handles insanity, pleas, and the fine line between criminal responsibility and mental health. The guilty verdict and life sentence reflected the position that, regardless of any psychological disorder, Brian was responsible for his actions and should pay for Warren Barnes' death. However, reactions to the sentence were mixed. Some believed the verdict was just, given the horrific crime Brian committed. Others felt he should have been treated as someone with serious mental health issues, raising questions about the effectiveness of the judicial system in dealing with individuals whose actions result from untreated psychological conditions. Meanwhile, the local community was trying to rebuild its sense of security and normalcy. The Warren Barnes Memorial, erected in a corner of town where he used to spend his days, became a place of reflection for many. There, friends and strangers left flowers, books, and messages, remembering the simple man who was tragically taken from their lives. For many, Warren's memory became a symbol of the fight for dignity, respect, and humanity, regardless of a person's life circumstances. However, the legacy of the Cohee case, far from being closed with the sentence, remained alive, not only in the city of Grand Junction, but also in the field of mental health and criminal justice studies. The case became part of a broader debate about how societies deal with complex mental health issues in young people, and how judicial systems can, or should, balance personal responsibility with an individual's psychological conditions. As the months passed following Brian Cohee's sentencing, the city of Grand Junction continued to process the ramifications of the case. While the case was legally closed, it left deep scars on everyone involved. For the community, the murder of Warren Barnes and the subsequent conviction of Brian Cohee raised complex and lasting questions about mental health, criminal responsibility, and the impact of untreated trauma on the lives of young people. The death of Warren, a simple man who had become part of the fabric of the city, was deeply felt. However, what truly shook the community was the fact that the crime was committed by someone who, at first glance, didn't seem like the type of person capable of such a brutal act. Brian Cohee's image before the crime, that of a seemingly ordinary young man, was replaced by something much darker. But the mystery of what was really going on in his mind was never fully resolved. This generated a climate of collective unease, with many wondering if anything could have been done to prevent him from becoming what he became. The fact that Brian Cohee was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole was a direct response to the crime he committed. But at the same time, it did not bring a sense of full justice to everyone. Brian's defense, which had pleaded insanity, had been rejected by the jury, but many continued to question whether he truly had the capacity to understand the gravity of his actions. The absence of remorse and the coldness of his confession fueled the idea that he should be held fully accountable, regardless of any psychological disorder he might have had. But was the true nature of his behavior beyond the simple understanding of a crime? This question continued to linger in the minds of many, even after the verdict. Furthermore, the case raised broader discussions about the justice system and how it deals with young people involved in such serious crimes. Brian Cohee's Insanity play highlighted how society, in general, deals with mental health in young people. Many questioned whether the system was prepared to deal with individuals who, even if psychologically affected, were still considered responsible for their actions. Others wondered if the justice system should be more flexible in cases where criminals may not be in full possession of their mental faculties. Reactions to Brian's verdict were mixed, with some believing he should have received appropriate medical treatment instead of being incarcerated, while others saw his conviction as the only appropriate response to the crime. However, despite the discussions and doubts surrounding the case, there was a clear conviction in the Grand Junction community. The tragedy should not be forgotten. The Warren Barnes Memorial, located at one of the places he frequented, became a symbol of resilience and remembrance. Many people, especially those who knew Warren, made a point of continuing to visit it, keeping his memory alive. The simple act of leaving flowers, books, and messages at the memorial became a way to honor Warren's life and reinforce the values of dignity and respect, regardless of each individual's life circumstances. Furthermore, the Cohee case also highlighted the need for greater investment in mental health programs, especially for young people. The city began exploring ways to provide more resources and support for those who might be dealing with undiagnosed psychological issues. Warren Barnes' death, and the way it happened, made many realize that violence doesn't just stem from moments of anger or despair, but also from deep internal disturbances that can often be invisible until it's too late. While the city struggled to recover emotionally, the case also affected citizens' perception of the safety and behavior of their neighbors. The shock of seeing someone so young, seemingly ordinary, capable of committing such a brutal crime, created a distance in personal relationships. People began to wonder if they truly knew those around them, and if they had missed important warning signs. The sense of security that once permeated the city was shaken, and the tragedy brought to light the vulnerability that exists within any community, where violence can arise from where it is least expected. The case of Brian Cohee and Warren Barnes became a landmark in the history of Grand Junction, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also because of the questions it raised about human nature, responsibility, and the justice system. The city would never be the same again, and the lessons learned from the case would remain present in the collective memory of all those involved. The tragedy of Warren Barnes and the enigma of Brian Cohee's mind have become a constant reminder that behind every face and every story lies a complexity that is often invisible. Warren's death not only altered the lives of his community, but also brought to light issues that would continue to be discussed and pondered for a long time. The fight for justice, for understanding mental health, and for the search for solutions to prevent future tragedies have become, for many, the most lasting legacies of this impactful case. The case of Brian Cohee and Warren Barnes, though concluded in court with a life sentence, left a legacy that would continue to reverberate in the city of Grand Junction and beyond. The pain of losing Warren, a simple man who spent most of his life in the shadows of society, and the bewilderment caused by Brian's behavior, intertwined in a narrative of broader issues concerning justice, mental health, and the complexities of human nature. Even with the case closed, the emotional, social, and psychological impact would persist for a long time. For many in the city, the case became a point of reflection on what could have been done differently. Friends and acquaintances of Warren Barnes continued to visit him at his memorial, where his simple yet meaningful life was remembered with affection and respect. The tragedy, though irreparable, highlighted the importance of recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their situation in life. Warren was not just a homeless man. He was a person with stories, with dreams, with dignity. His loss was felt not only by those who knew him, but also by the city, which found itself facing the collective failure of not having given enough attention to a human being who was there, in plain sight, but invisible to many. On the other hand, Brian Cohee's story generated an ongoing debate about mental health and legal responsibility. His behavior during the trial, his coldness, lack of remorse, and claims of insanity raised questions about the criminal justice system and how it deals with young people who, despite appearing normal, may be dealing with profound and undiagnosed psychological disorders. Many people began to wonder if society was failing to provide adequate support to struggling young people without a clear diagnosis of mental health problems. There was a growing sense that, to prevent tragedies like Warren's, society needed to be more attentive to warning signs in people, especially among young people, who often face emotional and psychological difficulties without the adequate resources to cope with them. The city of Grand Junction was thus forced to confront complex issues that, until then, might have seemed distant. As a small and quiet community, it was unprepared to deal with something so impactful. The case was not just about an isolated crime, but about how the system fails to identify and address the deeper problems that can lead someone to commit such cruel acts. The city found itself confronted with the reality that, often, evil does not come from where it is expected, and that it is necessary to look more closely at the invisible signs that people may be emitting. Signs that often go unnoticed until it is too late. The Cohee case also sparked a broader discussion about the treatment of people with mental illness within the justice system. Many believed Brian should have received appropriate psychiatric care before being punished, rather than simply being imprisoned for a crime he didn't seem to fully understand. Others argued that he was fully capable of knowing what he was doing and should be held accountable for his actions. The line between criminal responsibility and mental health care was, and remains, one of the most controversial aspects of this case. The dilemma of whether the justice system should treat a person as a criminal or as mentally ill remains debated, especially when an individual's behavior is so disturbing and incomprehensible. With the trial concluded and the sentence handed down, the city of Grand Junction turned to rebuilding, both emotionally and socially. The scars left by Warren's death and Brian Cohee's imprisonment would not disappear quickly, but the community began to move beyond grief and loss. The case served as a starting point for implementing necessary, though still unclear, changes in youth mental health support and care for those facing profound emotional difficulties. The residents of Grand Junction, who once saw themselves as part of a peaceful and safe community, now found themselves more vulnerable, more aware of the fragility of human relationships and the complexity of the minds behind acts of violence. They became more conscious of the need to listen and observe those around them more attentively, to offer support where needed, and to seek ways to address mental health issues more effectively. The case also had repercussions beyond Grand Junction. Elsewhere, discussions arose about how courts deal with young people in similar situations, how to balance criminal responsibility with mental health care, and how to handle cases of violence that do not have a simple explanation. Brian Cohee's case became a topic of discussion at law, psychology, and criminal justice conferences, cited as an example of how the system can fail when trying to understand the complexity of young people whose psychological problems are not evident or diagnosed in time. Ultimately, the story of Brian Cohee and Warren Barnes was not just a personal tragedy, but a profound reflection on how communities, legal systems, and society in general deal with issues that are difficult to understand and address. The pain of Warren's loss and the mystery surrounding Brian's motivations would continue to fuel debate for a long time. But the case also served as a reminder that mental health care and criminal accountability are issues that need to be treated with more seriousness and understanding. The legacy of the Cohee case would therefore be not only a story of tragedy, but an opportunity to reflect on and perhaps improve how we treat the most vulnerable in our society. After Brian Cohee's conviction, the case seemed closed from a legal standpoint, but the reverberations of this crime still echoed throughout the Grand Junction community. The verdict of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, although final, did not bring complete relief to those involved or to the city as a whole. The tragedy of Warren Barnes, which seemed to be an isolated episode of violence, became a landmark that would change how the city, and even the justice system, would deal with issues of mental health, criminal responsibility, and crime prevention. The community of Grand Junction, which prided itself on its peaceful and safe lifestyle, now found itself forced to confront the reality that evil can arise from where it is least expected. Brian Cohee, a young man who until then was seen as part of the social fabric, became the face of a difficult question. How could someone so seemingly normal commit something so brutal? His history was not one of prior violence or a history of destructive behavior. He seemed to be just another ordinary young man in the city. This is what most disturbed the inhabitants of Grand Junction: the fact that the crime was committed by a person who, at first glance, did not fit the stereotypes associated with violent criminals. This left many people wondering if they really knew who was around them, if they had missed warning signs, or if there was something even deeper and darker at play, something that could not be easily identified. The case of Brian Cohee was undoubtedly a reflection of broader issues surrounding mental health in society. His defense argued that he suffered from an undiagnosed mental disorder, which could explain the seemingly disconnected and irrational behavior he exhibited during the crime, and also at his trial. However, the court ruled that, regardless of his mental health, Brian should be held responsible for the murder of Warren Barnes. The question of insanity has raised an ongoing debate about the role mental health plays in criminality, and about the extent to which someone who commits a crime should be held accountable, even if their psychological problems may have influenced their actions. This line between criminal responsibility and psychiatric care was not clear to everyone, and the city found itself divided in its opinions on the case. Brian Cohee's life sentence was seen by some as a necessary response to the gravity of his crime. The brutal violence against Warren Barnes, especially the way the body was dismembered and hidden, indicated that the young man not only took someone's life, but did so with a level of coldness that suggested a lack of compassion and remorse. However, others considered that Brian could be treated differently due to the possible mental disorders affecting him. For many, the decision not to consider the insanity defense as justification for his actions was difficult to accept, especially since Brian's behavior seemed to be that of someone who did not fully understand the impact of his actions. Brian Cohee's conviction also brought to light broader issues about how society deals with youth mental health. In many small towns, like Grand Junction, there is a lack of resources and support for young people dealing with psychological disorders. Brian's case made clear the need for a more robust support network to identify and treat mental health problems before they evolve into something more serious and irreversible. While the justice system did its part in convicting Brian, many in the town felt the real failure lay in the fact that he was never adequately treated or diagnosed before the crime. With the case now resolved in court, Grand Junction began to move toward a deeper reflection on the lessons that could be learned from this tragedy. The city could no longer ignore the warning signs present in the community, and there was a growing recognition that greater attention needed to be given to young people at risk of suffering from mental health problems. The tragedy of Warren Barnes, while impossible to reverse, became a turning point that generated discussions about what could be done to prevent similar cases from happening in the future. At the local level, the case also inspired actions focused on education and awareness about mental health. Community and school programs began to be discussed to promote awareness of the signs of psychological disorders in young people and to ensure that those who needed help received appropriate care. Although many of these changes were small and gradual, there was a growing sense that the city needed to act to prevent another tragedy from occurring, especially in a city where mental health issues had previously been neglected. The impact of the case was also felt in broader discussions about the criminal justice system and how it deals with individuals with mental health problems. The debate over the application of the death penalty, life imprisonment, or the possibility of psychiatric treatment for those who commit crimes in a state of insanity continued to be a difficult issue for legal scholars and mental health professionals. The Cohee case became an example of how society needs to seek a balance between criminal accountability and psychological support. Meanwhile, Warren Barnes' memory continued to live on in the streets of Grand Junction. The memorial dedicated to him, where friends and strangers left flowers and books in his honor, became a place not only of mourning, but also of reflection. The city learned to value not only visible lives, but also those that often go unnoticed. And, on some level, Brian Cohee's case also forced the community to recognize that violence doesn't choose appearance or social class. It can arise anywhere, from anyone. The challenge now was not only to deal with the legacy of the crime, but also to transform painful lessons into concrete actions that could prevent new tragedies in the future. Following the guilty verdict and Brian Cohee's life sentence, the city of Grand Junction, though still shaken by the tragedy, began a gradual process of reflection and change. Warren Barnes' death and the brutal manner in which the crime was committed were not only a reminder of the violence that can emerge from where it is least expected, but also an opportunity for the city to look inward and question how it deals with issues of mental health, justice, and the prevention of future tragedies. The Brian Cohee case brought to the forefront a series of discussions that, until then, were often on the periphery of public consciousness. The city of Grand Junction, like so many others, was unprepared to deal with the complexity of the crime and the lack of visible signs that could have alerted people to Brian's psychological problems. His violence was sudden, without apparent motive, and worse, executed with a coldness that disconcerted even the most experienced within the judicial system. There was no criminal record or signs of a troubled youth, and this mystery made everything even more distressing. The case also exposed a systemic failure reflected in many small towns across the country: a lack of adequate infrastructure to address youth mental health. Although Brian was eventually diagnosed with mental disorders during the trial, it came too late. What could have been done before the case reached that point? The answer wasn't simple. The town, like so many others in rural areas, faced challenges in accessing mental health professionals, particularly for teenagers who weren't being closely monitored. This sparked a growing movement within the town to increase psychological support for at-risk youth and improve local resources. The issue of mental health wasn't limited to Brian Cohee. The case sparked a broader conversation about how societies treat those facing psychological problems, especially when those problems are not visible or understood. Brian's behavior during the trial, his apparent indifference and lack of remorse, fueled debates about how the human mind can distort the perception of oneself and others, to the point of leading someone to commit such a brutal crime without a clear explanation. However, Brian Cohee's conviction also raised questions about criminal justice and how the system deals with individuals with mental illness. For some, the life sentence was just and necessary, given the gravity of the crime. The brutality with which Warren Barnes was murdered, Brian's coldness in committing the act, and the clear lack of remorse he demonstrated during his confession indicated, in the eyes of many, that he should pay for the consequences of his actions. The life sentence was seen as a way to ensure that someone like Brian, who demonstrated a total disconnect from reality, could not commit crimes again. However, for others, the lack of adequate psychological treatment led to a deeper reflection on what, in fact, constitutes justice. Grand Junction, like other small towns, began to wonder what more could have been done to prevent the tragedy. The town could no longer ignore mental health and the profound impact that untreated psychological problems can have, especially on young people who are on the margins of society or in vulnerable situations. Warren Barnes' death was a bitter reminder that evil can arise from where least expected, and it forced the community to reassess its priorities. Although the legal verdict had been given and the sentence determined, questions about what could have been done to prevent violence and how to address mental health more effectively continued to haunt the town. The memorial honoring Warren Barnes, erected on the site where he used to spend his days, became a symbol of resistance and reflection. Many people from Grand Junction, especially those who knew him by sight or interacted with him occasionally, began visiting the memorial not only to pay their respects but also to reflect on the value of life, regardless of circumstances. Warren, who once seemed like just an unknown man on the street, became recognized as a symbol of the fight against social indifference. His death brought to light a reality that many, perhaps, had ignored: the importance of treating everyone with respect and humanity. regardless of their situation in life. However, the city didn't just sit idly by in mourning. The case also sparked a series of initiatives that began to be discussed in Grand Junction, aiming to improve assistance for young people with psychological problems. The city began exploring partnerships with mental health clinics, both public and private, to offer more robust support for those facing emotional and mental difficulties, but who may lack the means or recognition to seek help on their own. Schools began integrating more psychological resources to address at-risk adolescents, and the idea of creating preventative programs gained momentum. Although these efforts were still in their early stages, the Cohee case was a starting point for changing how the city thought about mental health and the role it plays in crime prevention. Furthermore, the case began to be discussed at conferences on mental health and criminal justice, not only as an isolated case, but as an example of how systems can fail when trying to deal with mental health issues. Professionals from various fields began to question whether society was truly prepared to deal with individuals whose actions were influenced by untreated psychological disorders. The Cohee case, with its complexity and moral dilemmas, became an important reference point in discussions about criminal responsibility in cases of mental disorders. The legacy of the Brian Cohee and Warren Barnes case is a mixture of tragedy and reflection. The brutal act of violence, the pain inflicted on the community, and the questions raised about mental health and criminal justice left deep scars, but also opened doors for necessary changes. Warren Barnes' story, marked by simplicity and humanity, merged with the story of Brian Cohee, a young man marked by the silent pain of a misunderstood mind. The case is a reminder that behind every act of violence, there are layers of human complexity that demand more than a simple condemnation. They demand a profound examination of how society deals with mental health, prevention, and justice. The case of Brian Cohee and Warren Barnes continued to reverberate long after the verdict. But as the years passed, Grand Junction began to find ways to transform the tragedy into a catalyst for meaningful change. While the impact of the crime was never completely erased, the city began to focus more on the issues that emerged from this tragedy and how they could prevent similar disasters in the future. One of the first and most visible responses to the tragedy was an increase in awareness about mental health and psychological support resources, especially those aimed at young people. The city, until then, had not given due attention to the mental health of its young population. But Brian Cohee's case highlighted the urgency of this issue. Local organizations and clinics began collaborating with schools and institutions to develop more accessible psychological support programs, aiming to identify at-risk youth before they reach a breaking point. The community understood that prevention is fundamental, rather than simply reacting after a traumatic event. Grand Junction, which has always prided itself on its sense of security and community cohesion, began to distance itself somewhat from its idealized and realistic image of a small town, confronting the darker realities that sometimes lurk in the shadows. The Cohee case showed that even the most tranquil communities can be affected by deep, often invisible, psychological crises that can manifest in devastating ways. Over the years, the city has also become an example of resilience and how the pain of loss can be transformed into a collective movement for positive change. The Warren Barnes Memorial, which continued to be a meeting point for residents, was no longer just a place of remembrance, but also a symbol of overcoming adversity. People of all ages began to visit it more frequently, not only to reflect on Warren's death, but also on the impact it had on their own lives and on the city as a whole. Warren, an invisible man to many during his lifetime, became a central figure of empathy and reconciliation, an embodiment of what the city could be, a community that looks to those who are marginalized or forgotten and seeks to offer more support, more understanding. However, the case was not without criticism. Although the judicial system fulfilled its role in convicting Brian Cohee, there were still those who felt he deserved more psychological help than punishment. The issue of insanity was raised again by human rights and mental health advocates, who argued that life imprisonment for someone so young and apparently mentally disturbed was an insensitive response to the complexity of the situation. Many still question whether the city and the judicial system were prepared to adequately handle the type of crisis Brian faced before the crime. The lack of early diagnosis, the absence of a robust mental health support system, and the lack of intervention before the tragedy were important points in the discussions that followed the case. As time passed, the Cohee case began to be incorporated into debates about justice system reform, especially regarding the treatment of young offenders with psychological disorders. At the state and even national levels, the lessons learned from Grand Junction began to influence mental health policies, both in terms of prevention and treatment, leading to increased pressure to improve mental health education in schools and the training of health professionals to identify and treat disorders early. Meanwhile, Warren Barnes' memory continued to occupy an important space in conversations about social justice and equity. He came to be remembered not only as the victim of a crime, but as a symbol of the invisible lives that often go unseen until something tragic happens. His story inspired a community movement of greater compassion and inclusion, in which citizens began to question their own attitudes towards those in more vulnerable situations, such as the homeless and those marginalized by society. The legacy of the case, therefore, was not just the legal closure, but the way it transformed the city of Grand Junction into a community more attentive to mental health issues and more willing to confront the invisible difficulties that were previously ignored. Although the cost of the change was tragic, the city seemed determined to draw something positive from the pain caused by the crime, seeking to offer support, understanding, and resources to those who might otherwise have been marginalized by society. Now, more than a decade after the crime, Grand Junction was no longer the same. The case of Brian Cohee and Warren Barnes became a point of profound reflection on what it means to be a community and how one should respond to the complexities of human life. The city knew that, while the impact of the crime could not be erased, the lessons it brought could eventually prevent something similar from happening again. And in time, perhaps Warren's legacy would be more than the tragedy that led to his death, but the transformation he inspired in the city he called home. The case of Brian Cohee and Warren Barnes left deep scars on Grand Junction, but it also generated essential reflections on mental health, accountability, and the prevention of tragedies. Although the city faced the pain of loss and the complexity of the justice system, it came together to promote positive change, focusing on psychological support for young people and greater empathy for those living on the margins of society. The legacy of Warren Barnes transformed into a symbol of compassion and reflection, and the lessons learned from the Brian Cohee case continue to influence the city today, reinforcing the importance of looking more closely at the unseen needs around us and acting to prevent future tragedies.